I regret to inform you that I wish to begin today by reading to you from an article by David French. Now, I do not wish to participate in French bashing. I've tried to keep this show throughout its lifespan relatively free of French bashing for the simple reason that I think we have enough of it out there in the world already. I don't agree with French about a lot of stuff. He's taken a track ever since Trump that really doesn't seem like the right one to me, and frequently he comes up with takes that seem ill-informed. So let that be known. I'm not, but I don't want to, malign the man's character or whatever. We've been there. There's been enough of that done already. I just want to read to you from this piece he wrote in The Atlantic. I think it's part of one of their newsletters. And it's headlined, "Ron DeSantis aims at Disney, hits the First Amendment." And French has been going on about this for a while, that DeSantis's efforts in Florida to rein in the radicalism of public school teachers, especially in younger grades, on gender issues and the LGBTQIA++ alphabet soup. DeSantis's efforts are a misguided attempt to crush enemies without regard for the First Amendment. That it's an insult to free speech. That it sort of betrays conservative principles, right? Undoes all of these years of commitment to free speech and the First Amendment. And now the latest thing that has happened is that DeSantis has been trying to take some legal action against Disney because Disney famously has announced that it, not only doesn't support the Florida law and wants to pressure DeSantis out of, making this law which again, just to remind you, the law it outlaws talking to kids in kindergarten through third grade about just any variety of sexual practice. The idea is, parents get to decide what's appropriate, and they get to have absolute, decision-making power over how their kids are raised and taught about sexuality, especially if these teachers, as they are doing, you can go on libs of TikTok or whatever and find them saying on TikTok, they take kids aside and say, your parents don't want you to know this, but boys can be girls, right? Like if your parents tell you that's wrong, nevertheless, like I'm your parents now, and so rightly, we've identified this as like groomer-like behavior, and DeSantis is trying to take action against this, and Disney is trying to pressure him out of it. And they're also kind of making clear that their vision for the world is to have a massive amount of LGBTQIA++ content so that kids can see the world in a way that will shape them to love and endorse the gay agenda, which I call it that kind of jokingly, except that that's what they say, right? Like we've seen clips of them now in high-level executive meetings saying we have a not-so-secret gay agenda. We want kids to be seeing this content. And so DeSantis, in the interests of his constituents, is attempting to take action against Disney, which has a massive business, obviously, in Florida, in Orlando, Disney World. The way that he's done this is to look into tax exemption, to direct the legislature to look into tax exemption that Disney has had since the 60s when it brought Disney World to Orlando. French argues that this is an assault on free speech and that the right has flip-flopped during its conservative move because it used to be all pro businesses having their opinions, right? Chick-fil-A is a great example that he uses, right? In San Antonio International Airport, the city council voted to bar it from the airport because, quote unquote, it had a legacy of anti-LGBT behavior, meaning just that its owners donated to, traditionalist conservative causes. The right was up in arms about this, and rightly so, because barring somebody from doing business in a location is obviously, a violation of the right to do business in a free society of free enterprise. And French says, he argues, one of the bewildering things about being a conservative in a populist age is the sheer speed at which populists will shift their opinions. So fast forward from the Chick-fil-A episode and move states from Florida to Texas. The Florida legislature raced to pass a law. I think he must mean from Texas to Florida here. The Florida legislature raced to pass a law revoking the Walt Disney Company's special tax status. The reason? Florida, led by Governor Ron DeSantis, is overtly and explicitly attempting to punish Disney for the company's opposition to Florida House Bill 1557, which bans classroom instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity in kindergarten through third grade, and in a manner that isn't age appropriate or developmentally appropriate in all grades K through 12. Okay. Now that I've brought you up to speed on the argument that's going on here and on the kind of conservative hesitation, which French is giving voice to, that, well, aren't we in favor of free enterprise and free speech? And should we be punishing a corporation, right, for announcing its intention, however distasteful, however odious, right? Should the government be, quote unquote, picking winners and losers? And isn't that hashtag Marxism, right? What I wanted to do is take a look at that question from a kind of young heretics perspective, which is to say, going deep into the resources that come down to us from the Western tradition and asking what exactly we mean when we say that we're pro-free enterprise. Because I believe that. I believe you have a natural God-given right to your property and to free association, and that when you put those two things together, you get the right to start a business, and nobody can tell you otherwise. I truly believe that. I believe that right comes from God, and the government, therefore, can protect it, but cannot take it away. And so why am I not up in arms the way French is? And why do I not think it counts as hypocrisy? And one of the things that I think a classical education can help us to do is to get our heads out of this minute, momentary, like, what are conservative values arguments that has to do with the latest controversy, and look back at the history of this country and not just say, well, what are conservative values, meaning like, what are the values on my team? These words they mean less and less every day because everybody's realigning and the issues on the ground are different, right? And so one of the things that then happens is these words, these ideas like, government shouldn't pick favorites. That's Marxism, right? These things become slogans and bumper stickers. And, they're holdovers from an age when they made a lot of sense, right? In the 80s and when the Cold War was raging, under Reagan, we had a coalition that built around a three-legged stool, right? And the three-legged stool was, free enterprise, free business, a strong military abroad, and and strong traditional values at home. Conservative Christians, in favor of business and enterprise, and in favor of beating the Soviets. All of those were reasonable responses based on conservative principle to the threat in the moment, right? As the moment passes, because the human heart is a factory of idols, we forget what the rationale was behind these premises, right? And so they kind of harden and they crystallize into bumper stickers. I call this the bumper stickerization of political beliefs, right? And so then we start saying, well, you're betraying conservatism, you're a Marxist, whatever. And it's the same way that the left does this thing. So you're a fascist, right? We start hurling these epithets at each other, and they just basically become tribal markers unless we clear away all that gunk and stop asking, like, what does it mean to be a conservative? What does it mean to be on this team or that team? And simply say, what actually are we preserving, right? What is the history of principle in this country that leads us to be in favor of what we call free enterprise, and what do we mean by that? And so in order to ask that question, I want to take you back to one of the central disputes over corporate law and corporations in our history that actually coincides with the American Revolution and with the founding of this country, and that is the fight between Edmund Burke and the East India Trading Company. If you want to be there when we build the Young Heretics empire, you're going to need Truebill. Now, I want all of my listeners and all of my followers to be as fabulously wealthy as possible. And that means not falling for dumb subscription scams. They do this all the time. They'll offer you some service that you sort of want maybe, and they'll give you a free trial. Try it on us. It's a month or it's a week or it's whatever. You sign up, get your credit card info in there, and then you just forget. This happens. They're counting on you to forget. And then suddenly you look at your bill and it's like, I've got Netflix, I've got FaceApp. There was a time when everybody was doing this like one trend, and then you signed up for that. And then, you had sort of like Chinese data streaming into your phone or whatever. Whatever it is, this stuff can add up. I mean, there are people out there who have saved something like $660 for the year on DirecTV, $120 for Sirius, $840 a year on car insurance. I mean, that's a lot of money each year. Truebill will go through your subscriptions and find the ones that you are not using, like the Netflix account that your ex is still watching movies on or whatever. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at truebill.com/heretics. This is really useful. Cleans out my finances all the time. Go to truebill.com/heretics, HERETICS. It could save you thousands a year. Truebill.com/heretics. Now, some of this stuff you may have heard me talking a little bit about on Liz Wheeler's show. If you're not a watcher, a subscriber to Liz Wheeler's show, go check it out. The Liz Wheeler Show. She's my dear friend, and she's really whip smart about politics and about some of the intellectual background of a lot of the stuff we're currently seeing. She's been doing some really interesting stuff about the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer, Antonio Gramsci, some of the things that we talk about here, cultural Marxism, all that. And I had the opportunity to guest host her show, and I was thinking about this DeSantis thing, and that's what kind of led me down this rabbit hole about Burke and Hastings. And I wanted to do a kind of Young Heretics deep dive into it, because this is the show where you get that classical education, a detail that you won't get in an op-ed article, right? Some of the history for its own sake that we can then take forward and discern the principles in the past and carry them into the present. And that's the antidote to the bumper stickerization of political values, right? Getting out of the present, as C.S. Lewis reminds us, and letting the clear, cool breeze of the centuries blow through our minds is one of the chief benefits of studying the long game, studying the West as a trans-historical phenomenon. And so I wanted to read to you a little bit from this article by a woman, I think it's a woman, named Miti Mukherjee, and I'm terribly sorry if I'm getting that name wrong. I'm sure I'm butchering it. I always have this problem, which is that when I read modern authors' names, I have no idea how to pronounce them, but they can write into me and tell me I'm a terrible person for mispronouncing them, I guess, if they're listening. But this article is from 2005. It's called Justice, War, and the Imperium, and it's about the controversy between Edmund Burke and the East India Trading Company. So what's going on here? We're back in the 18th century, the late 1700s. Burke, we've talked about a lot on this show, is one of the great statesmen ever, certainly of his day, and I think of all time. We've read in some detail his reflections on the revolution in France, in which he saw that when you sweep away all forms of tradition and when you tear down churches and you demolish the wisdom of the past and you think that you're going to charge forward into this purely rational utopia, it turns out that you've actually entered into a howling wasteland of aggression and a war of all against all. He saw that would happen way before anybody else did. And at the same time, he was sympathetic to the American Revolution. So he really discerned, I think, with great moral clarity, what was right and wrong in his moment in a way that nobody at the time really did, or many people at the time did not. What enabled him to do this? It was his grasp of the foundational principles of the rights of Englishmen and the natural rights of man. And it's a very complex subject, but he was great at talking about the rights that come to us from God and the rights that come to us from the government. And this was the central issue of the East India Trading Company, because what had happened was, at the time, basically corporations were not just companies that could be founded and started by anybody according to the same rules, but we had what was called special incorporation. And this is in England, right? The idea is, you want to form a business, you want to form even a town, you want to form any number of kind of corporate entities, and you petition the sovereign. That is, you go to parliament, you go to the government, and you ask for the right to incorporate. And that right of incorporation is granted to you on the specific terms of your agreement. So you work out your own specific deal with the government. And that's why it's called special incorporation. And it turns your group or your organization or your town or whatever into a legal person. So this was a big thing in 2010 when the Supreme Court was arguing over Citizens United, right? Can corporations give money to political causes? How much money can they give? And the whole thing was, are corporations people? And the answer is yes, in a legal sense. So legally speaking, when we talk about people, what we mean is entities that can have rights and duties. So you and I and every human alive are natural people, which is to say God made us people. We're human beings. And as people, we have some rights, Americans believe, that come to us from God. As citizens, we can also get other rights from the government, right? The government protects our God-given rights, or it should, but it can also grant us other rights and can grant specific people specific rights. For example, it can grant to a soldier the right to use his gun, right? I don't have the right to just use my gun willy-nilly. A soldier has that right in the context that the government directs. And so this is the way that basically free governments are supposed to work. Corporations, although they are not individual natural people, they are legal people. So there's a kind of legal fiction according to which they can behave as people and they can be granted rights and duties from the government. That is what had happened to the East India Trading Company. It had been given a monopoly, a vast swath of power and economic access to the New World, right? Because this is the time when the English Empire was spreading out throughout this incredible, vast expanse of space that nobody had known was there or nobody had known how to get to. And so they were doing things like bringing tea over from China. They were trading with India and doing all of these remarkable things that were enriching the empire. And the government had an interest, therefore, in giving to the East India Trading Company the right and the duty to go forth and do this business. Now, of course, this is going to become one of the big sticking points in the American Revolution because the East India Trading Company famously, right, tax on tea comes to the colonies. The colonists object to this is taxation without representation. You have the Boston Tea Party. All of that unfolds. But that's a more familiar story than the one I want to talk about today, I think, to most Americans. The one that I want to talk about today is Burke's objections to how the East India Company was behaving all over the world. And Burke had a personal stake in this because he had bought £1,000 worth of stock in the company. So not only financially, but also morally, he felt implicated in the actions of the company. And as a member of parliament, he undertook to redress what he considered a deep and vast injustice, which was that the East India Company was not simply behaving as a monopolistic corporation that had been given the power to do business by the crown, but was essentially behaving as the government of India. They had become what I would call a parastate or a para-government entity. Para in Greek means alongside or beside. And so a para-government entity is an entity that's not the government, but that works alongside the government as if it were the government. And this is what's happened. So here's Mukherjee. I'm reading now from this essay, right? At around the same time as the conflict between the British Parliament and American colonies was heating up, another affair at another corner of the world was beginning to occupy the attention of the English people. This involved the increasing financial and political influence in Parliament of the East India Company, a mercantile body that on the basis of its trade monopoly in the East, derived from a charter from the British Parliament, had amassed enormous fortunes from India, over which it was also rapidly extending its political power. Registered with the London Stock Exchange, this trading company that had also become the government in Bengal was effectively directed by a group of jobbers and brokers who, for all practical purposes, had become legislators for Bengal, determining policies for the company's government on behalf of the shareholders of the company. However, the company, in order to avoid the responsibilities of rule in the colony, had consistently refused to acknowledge the fact that it was no longer simply a mercantile body, but had come to acquire state power in eastern India. So Mukherjee is saying they had these rights to commerce, and they were accruing unto themselves rights also to rule, the right to govern, but they were not accepting the duties that came along with those rights. And this is what vexed Burke. He spent a lot of his career trying to rectify the situation. And the first way that he did this that I want to talk about, I mean, there were many different attempts, but I want to talk about this bill that he had drafted with his buddy, his bromance, Charles Fox. At this time, they were working very closely together. And Fox drafted this bill, which was really actually, in point of fact, the brainchild of Burke. And the idea was, you were going to have a council in London of governors, independent governors that could oversee what was going on in India so that the government power that was being exerted in the British Empire would be the power of the sovereign, right? Because the sovereign has the right to rule in Burke's view. And that's why Parliament even exists, right? Is because you need a government that is accountable to and responsible to the people, just as the people are also subject to it. And once you start dissolving that practice, you end up with all sorts of corruption. So he introduces this bill and he makes a speech in defense of it in 1783. So the revolution's already happened now. He's spoken in defense of it. The war is over. And here is what he has to say. And we should listen very carefully to this because it's very closely related to what I'm eventually going to talk to about when we bring this back to DeSantis and Disney and so on and so forth. So here's Burke. I freely admit to the East India Company their claim to exclude their fellow subjects from the commerce of half the globe. I admit their claim to administer an annual territorial revenue of 7 million sterling, to command an army of 60,000 men, and to dispose, under the control of a sovereign imperial discretion and with the due observance of the natural and local law, of the lives and fortunes of 30 millions of their fellow creatures. All this they possess by charter and by acts of parliament, in my opinion, without a shadow of controversy. And by the way, when I did guests on Liz's show, she texted me, she's like, have I been pronouncing controversy wrong my whole life? And the answer is no. Controversy is the American way to say it. This is another one of those things that I haven't been able to shake my British pronunciation from when I was a kid in London and from when I was over there for grad school. For example, as you guys are constantly pointing out to me in the YouTube comments, I say bean instead of been, like I've been to the store. This is another one, controversy. And I'm reading it that way because I'm reading Burke, but also I just can't help myself. Okay, so what's Burke saying? He's saying there is a natural and a local law, natural law being, right, the law of man, right, and of God, that this is kind of just how things are. And also in England and in India, we have laws set up to, prudentially maximize our circumstances and the circumstances of the subjects of the country and the crown. All of that is fine, and it's in the interest of us, of the Brits, to have this East India Company doing trade in the New World. Fine. It's all that I do not deny your right to that. And he says, those who carry the rights and claims of the company the furthest do not contend for more than this. And all this I freely grant. But granting all this, they must grant to me in my turn that all political power which is set over men, and that all privilege claimed or exercised in exclusion of them, being wholly artificial and for so much a derogation from the natural equality of mankind at large, ought to be some way or other exercised ultimately for their benefit. So we are naturally equal in the sight of God, and therefore we ought to be naturally equal in the sight of the law. And the law ought to treat us that way. If it elevates any one of us over and above the others, it ought to have a reason for doing so that is in the state's interest, and the state's interest in turn ought to be in the interest of the people. If this is true, says Burke, with regard to every species of political dominion and every description of commercial privilege, none of which can be original self-derived rights or grants for the mere private benefit of the holders, then such rights or privileges, or whatever you choose to call them, are all, in the strictest sense, a trust, and it is of the very essence of every trust to be rendered accountable, and even totally to cease when it substantially varies from the purposes for which alone it could have a lawful existence. He's saying we don't just let the government grant extra rights to random people and companies willy-nilly. That is a recipe for corruption. We don't just do this. They don't just do this for their health, right? They do it for the benefit of the people, and that enters them into a relationship of trust. This I conceive, sir, to be true of trusts of power vested in the highest hands, and of such as seem to hold of no human creature. But about the application of this principle to subordinate, derivative trusts, I do not see how a controversy can be maintained. To whom, then, would I make the East India Company accountable? Why, to Parliament, to be sure, to Parliament from whom their trust was derived, to Parliament which alone is capable of comprehending the magnitude of its object and its abuse, and alone capable of an effective remedy. All right, I want to spend some time on this principle before we move on with the story, because this is really important. It's important for us now. When you get to talking about current events like we're doing on this episode, it can be easy to feel stupidity fatigue, like everybody is just wrong all the time. The Spectator is a wonderful antidote to that because they have such high quality content and sophisticated writing. They eschew identity politics in favor of intelligent conversation and thought. Doesn't matter what the topic, Ukraine, the ideological war in the classroom, inflation, cancel culture, you can count on any argument in The Spectator, whether you agree with it or not, is going to be elegantly presented, well-written, and carefully reasoned, and man, is that needful. They have been dedicated to stimulating reporting and analysis since 1828, and now they are newly ashore in the U.S. with their U.S. edition of The Spectator, and they are offering a special deal just to my listeners. You can sign up today to receive 3 free months of the print magazine, full digital access, and a free Spectator hat. That is a lot, a big package for just going to spectatorworld.com/special offer and using the offer code Heretics, Heretics. One more time, you've got to go to spectatorworld.com/special offer and use the offer code Heretics. You get 3 free months of the print magazine, full digital access, and a free Spectator hat when you go to spectatorworld.com/special offer and use the offer code Heretics. What Burke is saying here is, in the world of special incorporation, where the government is in the business, right, of making specific deals with specific people to do specific things, you cannot just grant powers on the basis of whim, and you cannot just exercise powers or take them and run with it so that you become basically your own little government. Doesn't matter how far away it is, right? This is one of the main points of his argument, right? Natural law and the rights of Englishmen dictates that wherever you go, right, the principle remains the same. Yes, you can be granted as a corporate person, you can be granted rights and duties, but you must therefore exercise them for the purpose that they were designed for. And once you go beyond that purpose, you have broached the trust, and the government can take its power back, and must take its power back because the people require it. If you don't establish this principle, what do you have? You have corruption. This is what we mean when we talk about corruption. We talk about crony capitalism or whatever. What we mean is the powerful making deals for themselves to benefit one another and to benefit their own interests, but doing so in the name of the people and with power that by rights belongs to the sovereign, who in America, by the way, are the people, right? And in Britain is the king and parliament. Now, corruption is exactly what began to happen. And so this is what brings us to the trial of Warren Hastings, one of the most famous, perhaps the most famous political trial in English history. Warren Hastings, who was the Governor General of Bengal, and who was on trial in an impeachment trial from 1787 to 1795. That's a 7-year-long trial, dragged on and on. Burke was one of the main, advocates of impeachment, and he was an advocate of impeachment precisely because he believed that Hastings was implicated in the corruption of the East India Trading Company and was on the take and was doing all sorts of things to abuse the Indian people. And this is one of the greatest things to Burke's credit in our age of whatever, post-colonialism, anti-colonialism. In point of fact, right, it racked him with anxiety and guilt that this government, this colonial government, was being carried out in his name that was not obeying the natural law. So let's read some of his accusations now against Hastings, which are founded precisely on this idea that God has a law for all his creatures, that all men are created equal, and that natural law dictates that it doesn't matter, where you are. You still have to treat people with a certain, minimum level of dignity and respect. He says, these gentlemen, referring to East India and the crony government over there, these gentlemen have formed a plan of geographical morality by which the duties of men in public and in private situations are not to be governed by their relative relation to the great governor of the universe or by their relation to mankind, but by climates, degrees of longitude, parallels not of life but of latitudes, as if, when you have crossed the equinoctial, all the virtues die. This geographical morality we do protest against. Mr. Hastings shall not screen himself under it. The laws of morality are the same everywhere. This is a remarkable statement that's very typical of its era. And as we're going to get into in a second, that same spirit tells you a lot about the American situation, because there are some developments that we need to cover post-American Revolution. We need to think about how this works in our system. But I just want to read to you a couple more sentences from Burke, because I find that it both incredibly moving and deeply relevant, right? He says, my lords, you have here also the lights of our religion. You have the bishops of England. He's saying the bishops are present. My lords, you have that true image of the primitive church in its ancient form, in its ancient ordinances, purified from the superstitions and the vices which a long succession of ages will bring upon the best institutions. You have the representatives of that religion, which says that their God is love, that the very vital spirit of their institution is charity, a religion which so much hates oppression that when the God whom we adore appeared in human form, he did not appear in a form of greatness and majesty, but in sympathy with the lowest of the people, and thereby made it a firm and a ruling principle that their welfare was the object of all government, since the person who was the master of nature chose to appear himself in a subordinate situation. These are the considerations which influence them, which animate them, and will animate them against all oppression, knowing that he who is called first among them and first among us all, both of the flock that is fed and of those who feed it, made himself the servant of all. He was such a great writer, my goodness. And the style here is in service of a magisterial idea and a brilliant point, which is that God, by taking the form of a slave, as Paul reminds us, right, by coming in human form and stripping naked to wash the disciples' feet, placed himself on the side of those who are ruled, meaning that the law which governments instill must, in respect to God, have respect for the ruled. And it doesn't matter if you're black, brown, India, whatever, you read this stuff and you immediately see how absurd it is to accuse the great imperialists, the true British imperialists of some kind of unthinking racism. Just the opposite. He's saying it doesn't, these people are weaker than you, they're less rich than you, they have less power than you, they have a different color skin than you. It does not matter. They are children of God. And as children of God, if you undertake to rule them, you must do so with God's law in mind. And that is why we distinguish between rights and privileges that are granted unto a corporation by the sovereign, and rights and privileges that are man's, right? I'm speaking now in the American context, right? Which is what I'm going to get into next, right? But when we talk about natural rights, we are talking about how God's law applies to us. And those things are primary and irrevocable in a way that the benefits granted unto a corporation by the government are not. I have a divine God-given right to free speech, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to own and dispose of my property as I will. This is why slavery was such an assault and an affront to American tradition in American principles in Lincoln's eyes, right? I have a right to all these things that comes to me from God. No government can rightly take it away. The only thing that government can do in respect to those rights is protect them, which is indeed the sacred charge of the government. Totally separate from that truth is the deal that any government might or might not make with an individual corporation in order to press upon them a specific charge. Still fine to do that, but what Burke is reminding us of is that when governments make those deals, they do not do so in some kind of, heaven-sent, ironclad, incontrovertible law that is written in the stars, right? The deals that we make with corporations, the benefits that the government grants them in our name are not written in the heavens. They do not descend from God. Our rights, our natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness come from God and are more important, and they trump the rights that are given to corporations. And by the way, those rights that are given to corporations are given to them in service of we who bear the natural rights that come to us from God. And so if those corporations announce that they are hostile to our rights, then we have every right to take away the special privileges that we have granted them in the person of our representatives and of our government. That's Burke's main point, right? What the government gives, the government takes away. What God gives, no government can take away. Now, let's move over the ocean, right? Let's cross the Atlantic and let's talk about America, because a couple things are happening around this time which are relevant to this discussion and will explain why contract law and most specifically corporate law has evolved in this country in the way that it has in light of this story, this conflict, grand conflict between Burke, Hastings, and the East India Company. So, as I've said, the revolution is founded, at least in part, in this idea that there are natural rights, that they come to us from God, that no government can take them away, that governments are instituted to protect them. You can see Burke saying some slightly different, but nevertheless profoundly related things in his speeches. Now we have Hamilton and Madison, two founding fathers, who get into a fight over the bank. And this is not, unlike the East India story, I'm not really going to tell you at great length the story of the bank. It's not our story for today, but it is relevant insofar as it shows us that Madison, at least, was thinking about corporations in much the same terms as our pal Burke. So what's happening here is Hamilton wants a federal bank. He thinks that this is the best way to manage the finances of the nation. Madison is antsy about this because he thinks it puts too much power in the hands of the government, etc. And in the arguments about this over Congress, Madison says, that the powers proposed to be given are such as do not exist antecedent to the existence of the corporation. So unlike natural people who are born with certain natural rights, legal people don't exist before the government creates them and cannot have rights until the government gives those rights, and especially the rights that are over and above the rights that already descend. Some rights, of course, corporate rights, descend from God-given natural rights, such as the right to property, the right to free association. You can make a business with anybody you want. That's true free enterprise. But, says Madison, extra rights that you create in order to privilege a certain entity, right, a certain legal entity, are not yours from God and can be given and taken away by the government as you choose. Central to his concern here is the idea that a federal bank, as I said, will accrue too much power and be a source of corruption, just like the East India Trading Company was in its capacity. This is because he has this idea, which we have touched upon before, but which I want to elaborate upon a little bit, that faction, in the good sense of the word, is the remedy to America's problem of size. This was one of the problems of political philosophy in the revolutionary era and the founding period, is that we have this intent to expand across a vast array of territory. And the governing wisdom at the time, the conventional wisdom, was that republics can't survive in big territory because you can't administer that much space without some kind of strong centralized power. And so all the great republics of the past had been cities. Rome was a city. Sparta, was a city. In later history, in the medieval period, Florence was a city, right? And once they got too big, like once Rome expanded too big, that was the problem that caused them to have to submit to their class factions and then eventually to become an empire. And so Madison here is up against this French guy, Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, most likely just you've heard of him as Montesquieu, and he writes The Spirit of the Laws, and in The Spirit of the Laws he says it's natural to a republic to have only a small territory, otherwise it cannot long survive. In Federalist 10, part of his argument for the Constitution, Madison writes that there is a way to use a large territory to your advantage. And here it is. He says, the point of difference here is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory, which may be brought within the compass of the Republican than that of the Democratic government. He's saying Republican governments can bring in a large amount of territory. It is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing the majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or, if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked that, where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. So he's saying that actually, if we spread out, there will be less opportunity for any one group of people to make their power absolute and to exert the tyranny of the majority. And if they want to do that, if they want to gain power at a state or at a federal level, they're going to have to persuade people. They're going to have to make compromises between other factions and build up a coalition. And this is the bedrock of how American politics works. For him, for Madison, it was a terrible threat to this idea that there should be any corporation that was granted by the government federal power at the level of the bank, or indeed at the level of any kind of monopolistic para-government entity. And that's why we find him writing with dripping sarcasm in the National Gazette in 1792 about the perversion of his idea that has made for people to kind of argue for things like the bank. He says, in all political society, this is a parody of his own idea that he's writing, saying this is a kind of flaw in logic that my opponents have made. They say, in all political societies, different interests and parties arise out of the nature of things, and the great art of politicians lies in making them checks and balances to each other. Let us then increase these natural distinctions by favoring an inequality of property, and let us add to them artificial distinctions by establishing kings and nobles and plebeians. We shall then have the more checks to oppose each other. We shall then have the more scales and the more weights to perfect and maintain the equilibrium. This is as little the voice of reason as it is that of republicanism. So Madison is basically saying here, don't get it twisted. I'm in favor of faction only because it makes it impossible to accrue unto yourself unaccountable para-government power. If instead you appoint certain people, right, to have more power than others by increasing that inequality, if you he says favor inequality, which really is picking winners and losers, right, then of course you create a situation that is deadly to republicanism. All of this needs to be understood in the context of the fact that as America grew and as the post-revolutionary history unfolded, it turned out that special incorporation of the kind that the British Crown had been involved in the East India Trading Company, was a real impediment to the Madisonian ideal. Because for the very reasons that Burke identified, that once you get into these backroom deals between governments and corporations, it's very, very easy for those corporations to take those deals and run with them and become their own little fiefdoms. Therefore, throughout the 1800s, mostly in the 1840s, there was a shift in American corporate law away from special incorporation. And we moved toward this thing called general incorporation, which is what we now have, this idea that there's one set of rules for everybody. Everybody knows what they are. They're published by the government. And if you follow those rules, if you fill out the right forms, if you make the right declarations and commitments, then you are a corporation. You are now incorporated. You have those, whatever rights and duties apply to corporations generally, they apply to you. There are no special deals. There are no specific kind of ad hoc arrangements. There's just incorporation. And the states started moving to this in the 19th century for exactly the reasons that we've now been talking about at length, which is that if you don't do that, you create the opportunity for graft and you create the poison that will destroy and pervert Madison's idea of healthy faction, right? To fix that while still having such a thing as corporations, we moved toward this general incorporation idea. There were other reasons why we did it, but that was a major one. So now you have a scenario in which there isn't going to be this East India Trading Company stuff anymore. We're not going to do that. What we're going to do instead is we're going to have one set of rules for everybody. And DeSantis actually invoked this idea when he was talking about the Disney case. He said, we're not going to revoke any tax privileges for Disney that anybody could have, that just any corporation would be able to access. What we're going to look at instead is their special privileges, because this is the thing that I want to turn to now, is the fact that although we have moved toward general incorporation, we still have the possibility in this country, and indeed the reality today, of governments contracting deals with corporations so that the corporations can do the work of the government. And once they do that, once you say to a company, we want you to do X, Y, and Z, we're going to give you X amount of money, we're going to build you up in a certain way, you have entered back into a neo special incorporation situation, a new version of special incorporation where the government and corporations are in collusion, sometimes rightly, sometimes with every reason to be in collusion, but in collusion nonetheless, making deals that the government gives that do not come from God, that are not sort of one set of general rules that we try to derive from our natural right to property and our natural right to association, but are rather extra added benefits and duties that come to corporations from governments. And what did we learn from Burke? When you do that, what the government gives, the government can take away. And that's why I want to turn now to the situation on the ground with Disney, but I want to talk also about big tech, because that's another area where when you start saying well, maybe we should regulate some of this stuff, maybe they're a threat to the First Amendment, maybe the public square, the digital public square is being taken over by entities that have more power than us and can snuff out our God-given rights, right? When you start saying that, there's a certain stripe of conservatives who will say, well, that's Marxism, right? You just don't like private enterprise. If you don't like it, build your own Twitter, build your own Facebook, right? I want to talk about why we shouldn't be doing that, why that amounts to bumper stickerism and the bumper stickerization of old ideas, which, whereas they were true at the time and whereas they were based on those principles, those ideas don't work anymore. And we need to go back to the principles like we're doing here, understand the history of why we're in favor of this stuff. We have a new sponsor I am incredibly excited to tell you guys about, Ralston College. It's a new institution of higher education located in Savannah, Georgia. You guys, I want to go to Ralston College. Truly, this sounds like the most amazing program. It's a multidisciplinary curriculum of philosophy, literature, art, music, and architecture. I cannot think of anything that would be better for folks that like this show. If you're interested in this show, if you have a friend or a child that's thinking about college, this is the place. It starts with a term of language study in Greece. So get this, you will live and study on the island of Samos and travel to key sites of the Hellenic world, such as the Parthenon and Delphi. You go back to Savannah, Georgia, on a campus in the historic center, which is also an amazing place, one of the best cities in America, in my opinion. All successful applicants will receive full scholarships. You get a free ride if you get in. And extraordinary students who seek to do the hard thinking our time demands are what they're looking for. I can't think of a better place to find such students than among the listenership of this show. And the deadline for applications is May 21st. So if you're interested, visit ralston.ac/heretics for more information. It's RALSTON.ac/heretics, just like in the show. I would do it myself if I could. Ralston College, ralston.ac/heretics. So now, in order to contextualize what's going on here, right? In order to understand what we're actually talking about, I want to spend some time addressing just what it is that Disney had in Florida that is now being taken away, that the Senate just voted to take away. Because French, in his article, kind of breezed over it. Oh, tax exempt status. They took away tax exempt status. As if DeSantis was somehow revoking those general incorporation rules, the rules that apply to everybody. That would be playing favorites, right? That would be government picking winners and losers. That would be taking away the rights that everybody's supposed to have, or the access that everybody's supposed to have to general incorporation. And he explicitly said that he wasn't going to do that. He said, I'm not going to look at anything that anybody could have. I'm going to look at stuff that specifically Disney has. And it turns out that what Disney has, and I did not know this until DeSantis announced it, and if you blinked, you could miss it. Or if you were only reading kind of, legacy press articles, you might not see exactly what's going on here. Because he says, I'm going to direct the legislature to look into the Reedy Creek Improvement District. And you hear that and you think, that sounds like the dullest thing I've ever heard. It sounds like redistricting nonsense. I don't really care. But when you actually get down to it, this stuff is amazing. In 1967, the Florida State Legislature, working with Walt Disney World Company, created a special taxing district called the Reedy Creek Improvement District that would act with the same authority and responsibility as a government. Disney has its own government. They have this carved out county level government. If you look at it on a map, it's comparable to the size of Orlando itself. And it's basically like an Indian reservation, right? Where they can play by their own rules. If you go on their website, you find them, boasting about all the stuff that they've done, the municipal works that they've done. 22,800 water samples collected by RCID scientists from 1,500 locations on the property for testing every year, 134 miles of roadway and 67 miles of waterways built and maintained, 250,000 daily guests. So this is like, look at all this stuff we're doing in our private government that we own, right? This is something that if the left, the principled old left of yesteryear would be going insane over this. The idea that this gajillion-dollar company, because it's bringing in revenue, because the Walt Disney World is good business for the state, therefore gets to run its own little carve-out fiefdom, its own county government. This is big business in the extreme, right? This is not just general incorporation. This is not just like some tax break. This is a Vatican with mouse ears. That's a phrase from a book back before any of this was kind of in the news. This guy, Rick Foglesong, wrote a book called Married to the Mouse. And I want to read to you now a portion from his book so that you can understand what we're talking about here. We're not just talking about government interfering in free enterprise, right? Everybody gets their own government, right? It's like Oprah. You get a government, you get a government, you get a government. That's not how this works. Disney gets a government because the Orlando government thought this would be a useful way to encourage, this major source of revenue. So here's what Foglesong writes. He says, on the cost side, Disney World has generated traffic congestion, public facility deficits, affordable housing shortages, and a low-wage economy. These problems frequently accompany urban growth, but there is a complicating factor in the Disney Orlando case, for the Disney company got something special in coming to Florida, their own private government, a sort of Vatican with mouse ears, with powers and immunities that exceeded nearby Orlando's. The entertainment titan was authorized, among other things, to regulate land use, provide police and fire services, build roads, lay sewer lines, license the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages, even to build an airport and a nuclear power plant. Now, if you want to tell me that unless Walt Disney Corporation has the right to build its own nuclear power plant, we are veering toward Marxism and the government is getting too big and this is bad regulation. If you want to tell me that, I've got a bridge to sell you, because plainly, this is a case of a special deal between a government and a corporation that it has empowered to do certain things because it believed that it was in the people's interests. Remember that the government serves the people. And so these trusts that we give to these corporations come ultimately from the people who are sovereign. But, as Foglesong goes on, the Disney company never built and never planned to build the Epcot residential community that in their presentation to Florida lawmakers was the reason for their governmental powers in the first place. Leaving even just that aside, right? When Disney starts making noise about wanting to pipe LGBTQIA++ characters into your kids' TV sets, which remember is not just like, we want to show that gay people exist, it's rather we want to show kids these colorful, positive depictions so that gay people are good, right? Which again, I do think that it's gay people are good, right? I'm not arguing that this is so terrible that what they believe, although I think some of the stuff, like the kind of peak trans stuff, really is terrible. What I'm arguing is that they are proposing to pipe this into your kids' entertainment so that they can shape the souls of your kids away from what you want, right? You have the right as a parent to decide what your kids take in. You give some part of that right. You enter into a sacred trust with teachers and with the content creators that you put in front of your kids, that they will help you in that goal. But if they're not helping you, then the government, of course, is within its rights and indeed must reach into the privileges that it has previously given to companies like Disney and take them away, right? This is not like they're telling Disney that, you can't be a corporation. It's not like they're telling Disney you can't do business, right? They have all of their rights. Disney's rights remain intact. It's our rights that are under assault. And DeSantis, like a good federal servant, is taking action to protect our rights because that's what the government is there to do. Now, I want to also mention, and this is not something that DeSantis is really currently talking a lot about, although he has in the past, that the Disney thing, although it's a particularly extreme example, though they're running their own little fiefdom, right? The Disney thing is not the only place where these special incorporation privileges, these kind of neo-East India Company privileges exist. The other major place is big tech. And of course, when you start talking about regulating big tech, you get the same response. Oh, big government. Oh, bad, right? Oh, government picking winners and losers. But the secret to all of this is the government has already picked winners. And we have this idea, right, that Bill Gates invented a computer in his garage, and then there was literally nothing in between that moment and the way that Microsoft is now, right? That people liked the computers, they bought the computers. And what's the problem? They got to be a big company. You don't like it, build your own big company. You have your good idea, right? And of course, the digital revolution is amazing. Like, Microsoft makes good computers. People do like their product. It's not like they didn't, have some amount of free enterprise to get where they went, but they also had a major interaction with the government beginning back at the very beginning of the digital revolution with DARPA, right? This was during the Cold War. Again, it's not like this is some sort of leftist conspiracy or something. This is something that governments do. They enter into relationships with corporations so that they can pursue their own ends. And for those reasons alone, right? Which is why they can take that power away. They're not saying like, it's your God-given right to have these contracts. They're saying, we're giving you these contracts because we think that you can do stuff that we can't do as well. DARPA is a great example of this. This was this idea that there was going to be guns and butter. You have products that the corporations can make, like military technology, like information technology, which work in the war with the Cold War. They work in the Cold War. They make us better than Russia, but they're also a big part of what we ourselves want as citizens. You make this stuff in America, then if you build up business and you build up your military endeavor. This has been going on in big tech since then. For example, 9/11 happens, right? Terrible tragedy. The government begins to worry about terrorism in the US, domestic terrorism, homegrown terrorism. What does it do? It creates this thing called the Total Information Awareness Project. This is a project designed to keep tabs on people, to see whether they might be in danger of becoming terrorists or whether they already are terrorists. A legitimate aim, right? Something that in the wake of 9/11, people were concerned about, and the government, was right to be worried that this might spawn copycats and so forth. What did it do? It contracted a lot of this stuff out to Google. It paid $2.07 million to Google as part of this Total Information Awareness Program so that Google could help the government to keep track of you, right? And this is a major way that Google got a lot of its ability to track people, which they now sell, of course, because they sell your data, right? That's how they make money. Google Street View came out of this, right? The thing where they can just beam a satellite down into your street and see what's going on at that level, right? All sorts of powers that these companies have exist because the government built them up, at least in part, right, in order to serve its own ends. As a consequence, right, it doesn't, before you even start talking about like Section 230, everybody always talks about 230 is this, part of the Communications Decency Act, where if they act like platforms rather than publishers, then social media companies can kick people off, can curate content, whatever. That sort of thing is also a concern, right? But before you even get into that, you have to talk about the fact that like you're not interfering with some kind of like, plucky garage startup. You're talking about para-government entities. And if you don't believe me, you can listen to Jen Psaki, who gets up on the podium and says things like, we have these misinformation claims that are going around on Facebook, right? Claims like, that the vaccine causes infertility. And we are flagging those posts for Facebook to take them down, right? It's sort of like when Henry II apparently said, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest, talking about Thomas Becket. And of course, when the king says that, it's like, well, I guess we're going to go do this. This is this contract that they're in. They're basically saying, well, fair is fair, right? You guys want to be on our good side. We helped you get where you are. Now you got to snuff out the voices that we don't like, right? Misinformation is protected by the First Amendment, unless there is a 100% certainty that you are going to kill somebody by saying what you are saying. Not just anybody, not that some people might not take the vaccine and therefore die, but rather that everything that you say is going to directly lead to death and disaster, right? Then you have a right to say false things. That right comes to you from God. Your right to raise your children comes to you from God. Your right to start a business comes to you from God. Your right to speak freely comes to you from God. It is more important than Disney's right to run its own government. That's not a God-given right. And if Disney or Facebook or Google or whatever declare their hostility to our God-given rights, then they don't need to receive the benefits of our government anymore, because the government is our servant and enters into these contracts ostensibly on our behalf for the good of the state, which is the good of the people if the state is working the way it ought to as the servant of the people. That's why this is not a kind of betrayal of conservative principles. If you actually get rid of the bumper stickers, you get rid of the tribal designators, you stop saying like, well, true conservatism is X, Y, and Z. Stop thinking about all of that. Go back into the founding documents, study the history of this stuff. That's what a classical education is for. And you will find that we are not betraying our principles. We are recovering our principles. We are trying to save this country in the form that it was designed, hanging on by a thread, I know, but that's what we're doing. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Don't be talked out of your natural God-given rights. They are more important than anything, including the government, and the government exists to defend them. That's it for this week. I'm going to talk now about ugly art. I have a mailbag question from locals. Let's do it. It is a truth universally acknowledged that HR sucks. Bambi is the solution to this. If you are a small business owner out there, you need to be listening up because, man, I am not a small business owner, but I work for a business. We have a fantastic HR manager, and she is constantly sending me all these forms, which she just has me sign. And then I'm like, whatever. I don't know how any of this works, but the amount of time that she spends on this, it's an enormous job. And you make one mistake and you're tangled up in this, horror story of whatever, like a sexual harassment lawsuit or an HR compliance concern or whatever. It can cost up to $80,000 a year to hire a full-time in-house HR manager, but Bambi automates it all. Their HR autopilot automates your core policies, workplace training, and employee feedback, and your dedicated HR manager will help you navigate the more complex parts of HR. This can start at just $99 a month, which is a huge savings from hiring somebody to do it. So go to Bambi.com/heretics right now, and you will get a free HR audit on me. BAMBEE.com/heretics, HERETICS. Bambi.com/heretics for a free HR audit just for Young Heretics listeners. Help build the Young Heretics empire by saving money and complying with HR guidelines in the process. All right, Bambi.com/heretics. All right, mailbag questions come to me on Locals. We have an awesome community over there. The VIPs who sign up get to go deeper into this stuff, which, as you can see, right, has profound implications for the way we live our lives today. And in an hour, I can only give you so much, right? There is so much more to talk about. It's an endless store of wealth that comes down to us from the West. Locals VIPs are signing up to learn more. I do exclusive articles there. We have live stream Q&As, which I love. They're my favorite part of the whole thing because people ask these great questions. We get to talk about just everything, personal life, lifting advice, whiskey recommendations, but also the good, the true, and the beautiful, and how we live them out in the here and now. The other thing that VIPs get that nobody else does is the ability to ask mailbag questions. So I hope you will head over and join us at youngheretics.com/locals. Here's a mailbag question from Jay Tobler. Is Goya's Saturn devouring his sun beautiful? What about Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights or Stravinsky's Rite of Spring? You've alluded to this category of artistic beauty that is not pretty, the way the Pietà or the Ode to Joy is, but nevertheless deserves reverence for its artistic excellence. But what differentiates this kind of, quote, ugly, beautiful art from the scatological, campy trash of most modern art? What quality does it possess? This is a wonderful question, and it is very readily answerable by reference to our friends Aristotle and Plato. So first of all, let me say what he's talking about, right? Goya's Saturn devouring his son. You may have seen this painting, Saturn, myth of the, sort of pre-Olympian god who ate his children because he was afraid they would rise up one day to overthrow him. Of course, eventually they did because it was prophesied. But this moment, right, of a god devouring, a titan devouring his child, right? Obviously a hideous spectacle. But nevertheless, riveting and valuable art, I would argue, right? Same thing with Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, or indeed his, many kind of panoramic depictions of hell. Hieronymus Bosch, if you want to look these up while we're talking about them. Why is that beautiful, whereas a kind of the scatological campy trash of most modern art, so like, nailing a banana to a wall, or like putting a urinal in a exhibition or whatever, what's the difference? There is a passage in the Poetics in which Aristotle talks precisely about this phenomenon, the phenomenon of liking art that shows ugly things. And he reflects upon the strange fact that there is such a thing as art about ugly things that we would hate to see in real life. We would be disgusted to see Saturn a person devouring his son in real life. We would be hideously abhorred and appalled to see, a decaying corpse, I think is an example that Aristotle gives. But he says we like representations. And what does this tell us? It tells us that we have a natural pleasure in mimesis itself, that is representation, which presents the real world to us, has its own inherent value. It may not be, a value that eclipses all other concerns, right? It's not necessarily moral to put pictures of child eating into, say, a preschool, right? Nevertheless, as we grow older, we recognize that we respond to art that shows us things that aren't pretty, that are nevertheless true, right? And there's an inherent, profound, unsettling truth in the myth of Saturn, and depicting it conveys something to us. It conveys to us the anxiety, right, of fathers toward their children. It shows us the horrors that we do when we become, utterly inward directed rather than outward directed and directed by love, right? That when it's all about us, then we use other people and we literally eat them alive. Right? There's so much that you could stare at that painting forever and you could derive so much out of it. That is the difference between Saturn devouring his son and a piece of like excrement or something that you would just put into an art gallery. That piece of excrement is not telling you anything. It's telling you something very little, or it's telling you something false, right? It might be saying to you, this is what life is, right? Life is just flesh and filth, right? A lot of modern art is saying that. And that's sort of the point of it, is confront the ugly because that's what life is. And indeed, a lot of art that is, physically attractive is also nevertheless ugly in this way, that it doesn't convey truth. I've talked about WAP before, the Cardi B song, I think it's Cardi B, right? Yeah, the Cardi B song WAP, right, is bad art. It's ugly, morally ugly, because it's a lie, because it tells you not just that like there is such a thing as sex, but that promiscuous sex in public for money is good and fun and will have no consequences. That's a lie, right? And so it's bad art. It's even, I would say, ugly art. It's not, put it this way, it's not beautiful art, right? And so this distinction between pretty and ugly is not the same thing as beautiful and true, right? And this is why Keats says beauty is truth, truth beauty in the ode to the Grecian urn, right? It's not because everything true is pretty to look at. It's because there is an inherent beauty to truth, and that is our inherent attraction to mimesis, which is representation, that it conveys something true to us about our inner life, about the world, right? And if it doesn't do that, then it's just ugliness. The other passage to think about, which I've read to you already, is from Plato's Republic, and I believe the name of the guy is Leontius, who is walking past. This is a demonstration of the fact that we can have multiple impulses at once, right? And he says Leontius was walking past corpses. He felt it was wrong to look, but he wanted to. And at last, he looked, and he said to his eyes, look your fill, right? This is the same idea. That when you want to look on something ugly, what you're wanting knowledge. And man by nature reaches out to know. That's what Aristotle says in the Metaphysics, right? These observations combine, I think, to give us a rubric for distinguishing between beauty and prettiness, and between ugliness and truth. Right? When someone just shows you something ugly, he's either not telling you the truth or he's telling you a sort of half truth or a banal truth. But when somebody shows you something unattractive, for the sake of conveying profound truths to you, then he's making beautiful art, because beauty is truth and truth is beauty. Thank you for that question. It's one of my favorite paradoxes to contemplate, because I think it tells us so much about some of the things that both the right and the left can get wrong about art in the culture wars. Okay, folks, that's it for me this week. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If I do say so myself, I thought this was a great one. I had a lot of fun. And thank you, as always, for listening. Do join us at youngheretics.com/locals, and check out the Claremont Institute, where I work. We put out the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, both excellent publications in which I write, and many other even smarter people, much smarter people, write also for those publications. And donate to support us at claremont.org/donate. Let them know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics, because that helps me and the show. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.